thanks for you too, Richard and Massimo, for inviting me here. Your work, Richard, has been foundational for my upbringing as a prison researcher. And I also want to thank Massimo for taking such a generous and inspiring lead in this growing conversation about penality and prison life between scholars of North and South. It's something that's very close to my heart and the heart of and work of my close colleague, Andrew Jefferson. So it's just very great to be here. And as Richard mentioned, I'll talk about this article, The Politics of Prison Air. And it explores what air means and entails in penal settings and examines how carcerality attaches itself to air. And I explore this across two incidents about prison air drawn from ethnographic fieldwork in Myanmar. The first is a tale of an imprisoned engineer's subversive efforts to improve air quality in prisons. And the second case is on the design and building of tuberculosis wards in prisons that aim to bring prison air in line with international standards. And the analysis of these incidents draw attention to, on the one hand, a basic empirical and effective sensing of air as a scarce and coveted resource that prison actors appropriate to survive. On the other hand, attention is also drawn to the possibility of sensing with air, whereby discourses, technologies, rules, practices of air can be utilized as entry points for the analysis of prison governance and the transitional dynamics of carcerality. So I started a little background about my research leading up to this particular article, and I tried to weave together a reading of key elements of it. But yeah, I come from Dignity. We do advocacy, intervention, treatment, and research as an interdisciplinary knowledge hub. And the research end of the spectrum is where I roam around, aiming to understand how institutions enhance or inhibit violence, with a particular focus on prisons, staff, and reforms. And as an ethnographer, I focus on everyday life through long-term fieldwork, and I've mainly spent time in prisons in Asia and Africa, striving to understand prison life in the South through a non-normative lens, as it is, rather than as it ought to be, according to sort of a more hegemonic northern gaze and international standards. And for quite some time, my research has taken a critical look at human rights reform in prisons, what happens when institutions are tasked to appropriate seemingly new rules with a lot of polyvalent power and intent. And more recently, I've shifted this basic questioning of rules to things. And thanks to Andrew, I've been involved in a research project called Legacies of Detention in Myanmar. And together with researcher colleagues in Myanmar and another Danish researcher, Gabriel, we've been trying to study the present history of Myanmar prisons across three interlocking dimensions: experiences, politics, and technologies. And my focus has been on technologies. And through interviews with former prisoners and staff and international reformers, I've sought to tease out insights about the transition and intransigence of prison life by taking a critical look at the attentions with and the experiences of prison things in Myanmar. So I've looked at bunk beds, drones, architectural designs of visiting rooms. And in this line of questioning, I've stumbled into air. And in my case, it was a bit of an epiphany, where a particular human story sort of astounded me during fieldwork and heightened my sensibilities. And it's taken quite a fair bit control of my research agenda, and it came this article out of it. So now I'll try to read from the article, actually from A to C, but I've condensed it a bit, so we should be able to do this within 30 minutes. So in the early stages of my fieldwork, I was trying to find and interview Myanmar architects and engineers who had been involved in building and renovating prisons. And by chance, I heard about an engineer, I call him Ko Aung, with a particular intense personal history, who I managed to approach and interview a few times in 2017. In the late 1980s, Ko Aung was a student at the Rangoon Institute of Technology, which was at the heart of the civic uprising in Burma in 1988. And this uprising brought the military dictatorship to near collapse when Aung San Suu Kyi stepped up as leader of the democratic opposition. But the army managed to brutally quell the civilian protest, instigating an infamous period of severe abuse with thousands of political prisoners. And as a leading member of the student movement, Ko Aung was arrested and, according to himself, framed for murder and sentenced to death. Time at death row was harsh and the regime was strict. Sanitation was minimal. The stench was intense. Staff were violent and predatorily corrupt. I did not feel safe, he said. It was always in my mind that it could be tortured any day. But after a couple of years of isolation, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. And in prison, Ko Aung slowly but surely began to apply his engineering skills to assist the administration in maintenance and renovation projects. And eventually, he was given a desk in a small office building inside and was tasked to design all the new prisons in the area. And when a prison was commissioned, he and a team of fellow prisoners, clerks, made the estimates and design in accordance with the prison administration's preferred model, the classical half-spoke wheel structure of Mandalay prison. This prison was built in 1992 and signified the military's prime and prototypical manifestation of a modern secure carceral state. And the design was consequently rolled out across the country as a reference model. Brown was not happy with the designs, and in interviews with me, he repeatedly referred to the prisons he planned with regret. The Mandalay model represented a radically securitized space, and the panoptic form maximized the surveying sightlines from the central tower, while disabling any sheltering nooks or crannies that could afford shade and protection from the heat. And he was especially regretful of the lack of recreational facilities. So I asked Coan if he had been able to include any improvements in the designs that he had made when he was in prison. But he could only obey, he argued. He was ordered to work and make estimates according to the prescribed model. I did not come with any ideas, as he put it. It was only, yes, sir, yes, sir. Yet then he looked at me and smiled mildly, and he drew a quick sketch of two gable perspectives of a standard two-story prison barrack. The drawing revealed how he had managed to squeeze in one unnoticed subversive element in the design. He had stealthily raised the roofs of the wards from 12 to 14 feet to enable better ventilation on the upper floors of the prison barracks and allow his fellow prisoners who struggle with heat and overcrowding 2 more feet of air. Nobody noticed at first, and the estimate was sent off, and the contractor agreed. And Kwang was later told that the builder had noticed that he had to use more bricks, but nobody had seemed to connect the dots. So Kwang is now a wealthy man in a thriving construction business, and he generously shared his story with gleaming eyes, but his body also seemed withered somehow, slowed and tired. And I could not help but wonder how all these years of confinement must have been indelibly stamped onto his bones. This embodied legacy was especially visceral when he leaned over my notepad for a few moments to pick up the ambiguous practice of drawing prison structures, as he had done for hours on end, from a position of subservience, but also, I just learned, of subtle subversion. And the key point that this experience brought home to me ethnographically was the importance of prison air as a means for both suffocation and aspiration. But how to study prison air? Air is invisible but fundamental. It is meteorological, measurable, it has matter, yet you can harness air as a resource and command it as a weapon. But it's somehow invisible, diffuse, and profoundly effective. It is ever present and implicit, but also, as Peter Sloterdijk argues, distinctly explicated in late modernity as something that can be put to use, for better or for worse, vividly manifested in the chlorine gas clouds of the First World War. Unlike a Marxist emphasis on the solid and the apparent, Sloterdijk argues that the airy and the fragile are in fact the real, are urging scholars to examine the ephemeral to dissect the crux of contemporary forms of power. Whereas natural sciences may seek to stabilize air to inspect it, social scientific approaches to air embrace the instability of air and seek to discern how air is constructed and sensed in specific situations. What does air motivate? And how are efforts to orchestrate air animating or suffocating certain aspects of social life? Air is ineluctably practiced and political, and there's a growing literature which strives to understand these politics in relation to, for instance, pollution, atmospheric governance, and environmental injustice. From a different angle, but with equal zest, the anthropologist Tim Ingold emphasizes the importance of scholarly attention to air as a medium within which and through which human life unfolds on, in, and among the substances and surfaces of the world. Ingold defines air as a medium that affords 3 fundamental processes of respiration, perception, and locomotion to human efforts of being, knowing, and moving in the world. So in more concrete terms, I propose that the experiences, practices, and politics of air in prisons may present itself across 3 main incarnations: breath, smell, and wind. So firstly and most basically, air is manifested in breath and respiration. Air goes into the body as inhalation and out as exhalation and as gas. Air is life and death in the first and last breath. It nourishes but may also harm the body and affects discomfort, delight, freedom, control, constraint, calmness, and pressure, in the form of deep or labored breath. Along these fundamental lines, Frantz Fanon referred to colonial subjectivity as a situation of combat breathing, to show how the subject of colonial state violence is positioned in the fraught, traumatic, and potentially fatal exercise of combat breath. In a sense, we may consider a resonating disciplining of the breath of the incarcerated as they live in the shadow of potential asphyxiation, always facing the risk of losing the right to breathe, purposely in the hands of violent keepers, but probably more often by default, as they are exposed to self-gassing and harmful emissions in absurdly overcrowded environments. Conversely, prisoners may also seek to reclaim autonomy, belonging, peace, and purpose by way of breathing. I interviewed one former prisoner in Myanmar who had struggled immensely with the heat during his early days of imprisonment. He was highly uncomfortable, he told me, unable to sleep, desperately fanning himself, always jogging for a place in the shade. And it puzzled him that the seasoned political prisoners in his unit seemed to be remarkably unaffected, and they taught him how to meditate on the heat. He learned to tune into his breath and let it travel to the most annoyingly hot spot on his body, linger there, dissolving the discomfort. And later, while in absolute distress and in solitary confinement after severe torture, he returned to the meditative breathing, empowering himself to accept death through intense meditation, and in turn mobilizing his capacity to die as a key resource to protest fearlessly against his keepers. So pains of imprisonment are typically invoked in relation to prisoners' loss of control of where they can go, what they can eat, who they can be with, how they can care for themselves. But the fact that someone, in this case the state, may control prisoners' ability to breathe in a bureaucratized and punitive way seems even more fundamentally invasive and disturbing. Consequently, prisoners' access to fresh air is also a key human rights concern. And these standards persistently conflict with prison authorities' insistence on securing infrastructures against escape and controlling the movement of people and things in prisons. Thus, any opening in prison walls aimed to let in light and air animates a securitized backlash towards barring, glazing, or simply cementing. Less in focus in formal juridico-technical management, but equally charged, albeit in more insidious ways, is prisoners' ability to protect themselves from smell, so the second dimension. So the most intense quality and character of air is the way it smells. The smell of air provides and produces olfactory distinctions between what is civilized and ordered versus animal-like and chaotic. Smell is probably one of the deepest set indicators of class and power, and a medium for ideological emissions into the world and into our bodies. As George Orwell famously wrote, we were taught the lower classes smell. The ability to avoid smell is a key feature of prison life. And it's an evident example of this is the economy of stink in the privilege and rent systems of communal prison wards. In the wards, strong prisoner leaders typically administer the sleeping places by controlling the prison real estate. The nearest space, the space nearest the single light bulb, the ventilation fan, or the television set, and in the case of Myanmar prisons, the auspicious place near the small Buddhist shrine in the wards is cordoned off and reserved for the ward leader and his or her deputies. This privileged space is easily recognized by the extra room between the powerful prisoners' relatively extravagant mattresses and their piles of blankets, radios, civilian clothes, and other kinds of quasi-contrabands. And wealthy prisoners can pay their way into this exclusive area or rent other preferred sleeping places at varied prices according to space, light, privacy, and ventilation. Poorer prisoners pay in kind and services, wash clothes, cook, clean, offer transactional sexes, and so on. And the poorest of the poor who cannot pay must settle closest to the latrine and shit buckets. And in this sensorial value system, class and caste are crudely reproduced according to the prisoner's proximity to the light and the latrine. As Brandt knows, scholars would do well to understand the odoriferous language of a given place and understand how persons becomes individual and cultural subjects by altering, adopting, or refusing smell, or being unable to do so, I want to add here. Political prisoners in Myanmar typically live in small cells, unlike the convicts and pretrial detainees on criminal charges who stay in the large dormitory-style wards. Several political prisoners mentioned to me during interviews the challenges of learning to accept the smell of shit. 2, 3, 4 cellmates had to manage bodily positions and practices of excretion in an extremely cramped space and against the grain of their securitized environment. To dampen the smell, a brick was normally placed on top of the clay shit buckets. But that was not allowed for political prisoners due to security concerns, aggravating their sense of negligence and unfair treatment. Yet this foulness could also be activated, and several former prisoners told me how the shit buckets, as well as coffins, were key conduits for high-level contrabands, passing in and out of cells and across prison walls, olfactorily protected from staff scrutiny. Thirdly, and more mundanely, air incarnates as wind. Wind represents the more immediate physical elements of air in terms of locomotion and temperature, and with ensuing linkages to technologies of sheltering people and places from air, harvesting the power of air in windmills and turbines, or directing and conditioning air in the form of ventilation, heating, and cooling. A giant leap forward in the development of mechanical ventilation of public buildings was apparently brought by the need to combat the dreaded gold fever, later known as typhoid, which ravaged British prison in the 18th century. So the perennial problems of keeping massive numbers of incarcerated people, not only in custody, but also separated and most challengingly alive, spurred significant attention to air governance in European cities during the birth of the modern prison. This was less pronounced in the colonial settings, and historians of colonial prisons broadly argue that the huge investment in salubrious and disciplining penality in the metropole, which Foucault has so convincingly dissected, rather took unwieldy and hybrid forms in the colony. And it's well documented how pragmatics and brutality allowed communality, porosity, and death to characterize the carceral conditions in colonial prison. So the general experience of ventilation and temperature in prison seems to be one of neglect and deprivation, also today. A recent case from the US has raised exactly this issue in relation to the death of Larry McCollum, who was serving a short sentence in a Texan prison for passing a bad check in 2011. Due to lack of air conditioning in the prison dormitory, Larry's body temperature rose to 43 degrees Celsius, which permanently damaged his brain and killed him. His lawyers filed a class action litigation challenging the high indoor temperature in Texan prisons. And the lawyers proved their point by asking why only a few places in the Texan prisons are air conditioned, such as the warden's office, the infirmary, the visitation room, the dog kennel, and last but not least, the armory, to ascertain that the bullets do not overheat. The case eventually reached a settlement in 2018, mandating air conditioning of one of Texas' most hot prisons. So as the Texan debates on prisoners' right to air conditioning show, the windy dimensions of air are potentially harmful. In this case, prisoners were exposed to heat and cold by omission, but air can also be commissioned as a weapon through intentional conditioning, pressurization, and concoction. This is clearly illustrated in the spiking global tendency to mundanely arm prison guards with non-lethal weaponry, pepper sprays, and in the intentionally engineered conditions of uncomfortably low temperatures in cold cells in Guantanamo or the immigration detention centers on the US-Mexican border, commonly known as hieleras or freezers. Still, conditioning of air in prisons, of course, also includes seemingly benign efforts to channel and temper the wind. Fans, coolers, heaters, purifiers are invoked as lauded game changers that will bring about more effective, modern, and ordered airflows. Yet from an ethnographic perspective, such interventions cannot simply be understood as more or less successful diffusion of the inert qualities of these technologies. The ambiguities of technological appropriation were central to the second air incident in Myanmar that I'll briefly present here before concluding. So after years of limited access to work directly with Myanmar prison authorities, major international development actors experienced some openings during the recent democratic thaw from 2015, a period that ended abruptly with the military coup in February this year. Last year it is now. International agencies began to train prison staff in human rights, build school facilities, visiting rooms, and advise on policies and guidelines, for instance, on health. And a substantial multi-agency prison health project was developed in Myanmar with a significant infrastructural component of setting up 3 new clinics inside selected prisons, including tuberculosis wards. In 2016, a small group of engineers from an international development organization were tasked to design functional new structures and find a suitable site within the extremely limited space inside the prison compound. In prisons, constructions must formally comply with every prison security imperative of prison management, and when refurbishing and adding, in this case, small clinics to an existing prison structure, Complying with these demands posed numerous practical problems. Where to put the prisoners in the meantime, how to secure the tools, how to transport the materials in and out. Yet the hardest nut to crack for these engineers was to ensure that the TB clinics lived up to the international standards and best practice of managing contaminated air. In TB wards, breathing is risky. Infectious breath, which circulates strains of tuberculosis bacillus, must be intensely controlled to avoid cross-infections. Managing the wind in TB wards by way of ventilation, removing contaminated air safely while ensuring access to clean air, is therefore a crucial and highly regulated affair. The ability to follow these regulations in practice is further complicated in poor overcrowded contexts like Myanmar, where electrical ventilation is unsustainable. In this case, the engineers consequently prioritized natural and mechanical ventilation, and they suggested to put up doors on the gables to enable cross-ventilation. But the prison management pointed out that they would then have to place guards there, straining manpower needs beyond the prison's capacity. So the doors were consequently designed out again. Meanwhile, senior officials at the headquarter level in Europe refused to approve the design unless the required airflow was ensured, suggesting instead at some point in the extensive Skype-mediated negotiations to install high-tech electron vacuum suctions. According to the engineers on the ground, this would turn the TB wards into a lethal health and infection trap. When the suction stopped due to regular power cuts or bad maintenance, the prisoners would die in 15 seconds, one engineer said, shaking his head. So in the end, a solution was thought up where central corridor running down through the clinic enhanced cross ventilation, while solid rather than grilled cell doors limited the contamination. Still, air change per hour had to be minutely calculated, even down to deducting the mosquito net covering of the windows, including the expected particle blocking if the nets were not cleaned. So in terms of ventilation, the chief engineer said, the clinic will be like a spaceship that has landed in prison. In one spot, however, the engineers had to compromise. Unsustainable low-tech solutions. They needed, on the one hand, to contain the highly contaminated air and bodily fluids from the patient's toilets, according to international standard, and on the other hand, also to accommodate the prison service insistence on disallowing prisoners' privacy in fully closed toilet cubicles. The result was a half-walled toilet and the installation of an electrical ventilator that, unlike low-maintenance mechanical ventilators, which were put up elsewhere, was powerful enough to change the contaminated toilet air. The TB patients got their toilet, but the everyday pragmatics of balancing care and control were also sustained in a situation of surveillance, and they were exposed to new vulnerabilities of power cuts and technological breakdowns. So my ambition here has been to encourage a scholarship that smells, breathes, and feels prisons rather than sees them only. What I refer to as an ambition to sense prison air empirically, very much in line with the formidable volume on sensory penalities that came out last year. The sensing of prison air invites a promiscuous interest in the smelly, windy aspects of imprisonment during fieldwork and in writing up. Such interests also offer opportunities to activate notions of toxicity, temperature, oxygenation, and freshness to the data sets and conceptual repertoires of prison research. In turn, sensing air propels prison researchers to examine how air is governed, how discourses and technologies of air produce positions of power, and how local social actors are disposed to appropriate them. Examining air can show how breath, smell, and wind are valued and rendered eligible for regulation, institutionalization, and tooling up. Studying prison air is thereby not only a matter of inhaling, smelling, or feeling, but of utilizing air as an analytical lens with which to uncover agentive struggles and competing ideologies at play at a given time and space, what I refer to as sensing with air. The two air incidents portrayed here make it apparent that the struggles over air have changed in Myanmar prisons. In the 1990s, the military regime modeled the carcerality state to quell the enemies of the state, extract their labor, and contain them in a shadow of death. Resistance was atomized, relational, and individualized, like the prisoner who learned to meditate to stand the heat. The military state exerted a penal willingness to let die, a form of power akin to what Mbembe refers to as necropolitics. Still, in this destructive environment, the engineer prisoner managed to quietly raise the roof. Stealthily, he turned the deadly power of the carceral machine back onto itself, but from within it. from the opportunistic bricolage of limited available means of subversion, and from a position of complicity. In the case of building the new TB wards, the necropolitical core of Myanmar prison seemed to be mutating, as the prison authorities sought to embrace not just a project of control, but also of care. International lawyers, doctors, and engineers working on the global regimes of human rights and development were getting a foothold in Myanmar prisons, fueled not by the will to let die, but conversely by a global technical and depoliticizing will to improve and steward interventions towards seemingly salubrious penal reforms. Yet the paradoxes persisted when security imperatives trumped juridical technical principles and produced pragmatic, syncretic relations between control and care, rights and deprivations, as colonial, necropolitical, and welfarist penalties sedimented and intersected. It remains to be seen how the unfolding coup affects breath in Myanmar prisons. The thousands of illegally detained protesters are right now in combat breathing mode and likely to suffer aerial pains of heat, cold, stench, and deprivation of fresh air and the right to breathe. In a time of crisis, prison authorities are likely to both fall back on old modes of coercion and improvise new ways of control to produce custody of the newest generation of political prisoners in Myanmar. I posit that the sensing of and with air revisits the fundamental of being human and incarcerated, expanding the toolkit by which researchers and activists may track and check penal excess, also in the gaseous, penetrating, and ephemeral guises of late modern power. Studies of prison air may reveal new weapons of control and contestation, new practices whereby punishment is heaped onto sentencing, or new modes of suffocation and aspiration in everyday prison life, opening the established medical legal reading of the prison up towards a transdisciplinary scrutiny that focuses on space, bodies, effects, and atmospheres. Over time, as I've tried to do here, or right now, as the coup demands intense, immediate, and critical attention. So the article, it ends here. To me, it remains quite compelling to continue to submit air to further scrutiny, in my case, in the field of torture, violence, and confinement. So air is forcefully weaponized and occupied by elites to reproduce power, but as we've seen, it's also accessed and invoked to claim rights to voice and space. So my plan is to forge ahead and explore the propensity and potentiality of air to enhance and inhibit violence. And I hope some of you might join me. Thank you very much.